Hello the internet and welcome back to my channel. Today on the bench I have a USB sound card. This is a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 and it's a 2-channel input, 2-channel output card. Now I purchased this card for my own use and obviously it needs some TLC because it would be too easy for me to just buy things that just work. Particularly the USB connector is broken and I have some replacements here that I hope they will fit onto this PCB, and I believe I can see the remaining of a jack connector inside channel 1 because the jack doesn't fit entirely and I can see the remaining of something at the end of the connector, so we might need to take a look at that. After that, I just hope that this works. This is supposed to be a fairly decent quality USB audio interface, even though I understand this is generation 1 of the Scarlett 2i2 and I believe the latest one is generation 4 if I'm not mistaken, but hopefully that will do what I need to do for my audio needs. Let me thank today's sponsor, PCBWay, more of that in a minute, but now let's take a look at this sound card and let's see if we can fix it. Okay, here is the card and this is the broken USB connector, and I think that the ones I have will fit. Yeah, I think this is gonna work. So let me fire up my hot test station, my soldering iron, everything. We'll remove this one and try and fit this one and see if the card works. Right, I got my Windows laptop with the drivers already installed for this card. I haven't tested the card though, and I suppose we're supposed to see a light in here where it says USB if everything works. So let's plug this up and let's hope that it works. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, well, Windows is not too happy. I saw some lights here. And it says device not recognized. When I plugged this up, I saw the lights flashing for a moment, but that was it. Let's try this again. Okay, Windows is seeing something, but it's not happy with it. I'm wondering whether this is a driver issue or, you know, something happened with this card and it's really unhappy now and it doesn't work anymore. So, yeah, guess it's not such an easy fix. I'll have to look into that a little bit. Right, so I've been playing with this interface for a little bit and I'd like to show you what I found so far. So the first good news is I found the schematics for these interface. Well, not exactly these very card schematics. It's for the 2i4, which is 2 inputs, 4 outputs. But so far, it looks like that everything which is not audio related is matching 100%. So the power supply section, the digital section, which is the one that we want, because at the moment, obviously, we have an issue with USB. So it's nothing to do with sound. Now, the issue we are having is, if my understanding is correct, the card is not responding to the host, which is my Windows computer, is not responding with an identification. Now, if Windows said unknown device, that would be easier. It means I have an identification code from the device, it's just I haven't got drivers. I can't really find a match on my database, so I really don't know what it's being connected to the computer. But what's happening here, if I understand correctly, is Windows is able to detect there is something connected, but this interface is not sending back any identification. So Windows says, I have no idea what's connected. I only see that there is something connected, but it's not responding to my calls, so I don't know what to do with it. It sounds like there is an issue with USB communication and, let's say, the digital section of the board. Now, looking at the board itself, here we got the USB input, and here on the left hand side, on this side of the board here, we have a small power supply section. We got 5 volts coming in, and we have a number of voltage regulators generating several different voltages, and we'll take a look later on to make sure that they are all working, because different chips, they work at different voltages. And on this board, being a sound device, you have 2 different supplies, one for the digital section, one for the analog section. You want to keep the noise of the digital away from the sound outputs, obviously. Now here in the middle, we have the main CPU. It's called XMOS, and the CPU is also connected to this little chip here, which is an Atmel memory chip, which I guess contains the firmware of the board. Very important is this little chip here, which is the USB interface between the host, the computer, the cable, and the card itself. And obviously that's where I've focused much of my attention over the past few hours to see whether there was something wrong with it. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to USB stuff, but my understanding is that when power is applied, the CPU is booting up, is reading the firmware, and then it's talking to the host using the USB IC, which is more or less just an interface in between the sound interface itself and the computer. So the fact that the computer is not getting anything, it's clearly something to do, in my opinion, with these 3 devices, the CPU, the firmware, and the USB interface IC. So what we can do in a minute, we can put this board under the microscope, because everything is pretty small in here, and we can make sure that all the voltages are there, the clocks are there, you know, the usual basic troubleshooting, making sure that the supplies are there and the basic signals are actually there. Now, one thing I discovered while I was poking around is that the right-hand side of the board was more or less unpowered. All these little chips here, these are on the analog, on the sound section of the card, were not getting the voltage, the supply voltage. So at first I thought, okay, well, that's it. We got an issue with the supply. Something's happening, even though I thought, well, that's the sound section. Maybe there's a chance that the sound is not working until there is something actually connected to the card. And the schematics actually confirm that, at least if I understand that correctly, because the analog section, as I said, has a separate supply, and this supply is getting an enable signal, which comes from the CPU. So it looks like the CPU will only enable the sound section when, I guess, something is connected to it, when there is a valid USB connection, or when the CPU is booted up, maybe it's not booting up, but when the CPU is happy or something happens, then the rest of the board will be powered on. Okay, we are under the microscope here on the right hand side. This is the USB connector. So the first thing I want to do, I'm in continuity mode. We can see that these are the data lines from the USB going to the USB IC. I want to make sure that these should be an inductor. It says L4, so I want to make sure that the inductor is actually working. One end is good, and the other end is good. Now the next thing, I want to make sure that the pins of the USB port is they're actually going straight to the IC. It's going to be a bit fiddly, but I can try that. This is good. And this is also good. So it looks like the data from the USB is reaching the USB IC. Now the next thing to do is to start checking those voltages I mentioned before. So let's power up the interface. Now I'm checking on this U1, this is a voltage regulator, and it should be the one responsible for the 3.3 volts output. And I believe the output is this pin here. We got 3.23 volts, which is totally expected, it's totally fine. And by the way, this is the input, so we got the 5 volts coming from the USB itself. So 3.3 volts is fine. Next one is U2, which is delivering 1 volt, which is going to be for the CPU. And this is in between these tall capacitors. I make sure I try not to short it. So there it is, we got 1.042 volts, so the 1 volt is fine. Now, according to the schematics, there are 2 more voltage regulators on this board. One is for the 48 volts for the microphone, which, I don't care at this time. And the other one is it's called the plus and minus VA, and that's for the analog section. And that receives an enable signal from the CPU. So again, I'm not interested at that moment. It looks like we have bigger problems than the analog section at the moment. So let's move on and let's make sure that these voltages are actually reaching the relevant ICs. Now, looking at the schematics, the USB IC works with 3.3 volts, and we start from where the little white dot is, and we go counterclockwise. We got 6 pins per side, so 6, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So let's see what 16 says, which I can measure on this. I think it's a capacitor here, and I'm measuring 3.2 volts, so that is totally fine. Now the CPU is getting a few voltages, but the core one, the one which is used internally for the CPU to work, is that 1 volt that we measured on that voltage regulator, U1 I think it was, or U2, one of the two. And it's going to be to pin 12, which is in the middle of that. So I can measure around at this capacitor here, and I'm measuring 1 volt. So the CPU is getting its core voltage. And we can also check the I/O voltage, which is on pin 1, so it's pretty easy to check, which is 3.3 volts, so that's also totally fine. Now this little IC is the Atmel, you can't really see it, but it should be, it's the Atmel 25DF041A or something like that. It's our memory IC, it's where I think the firmware is stored, so it's pretty important. And voltage supply here is coming on pin 8. And we are measuring 3.3 volts. So let's say bad news, as everything seems to have the voltage and it doesn't look like it's a simple thing as a voltage missing. So the next step is to have a look with the oscilloscope, and the plan is to see whether there is any activity, data activity, between the CPU and the firmware, and also between the CPU and the USB chip. We got the oscilloscope and the microscope on screen, and I'm probing pin 6, which is one of the data lines, and the card is currently unplugged. The oscilloscope is in roll mode, so if there's any activity we should see that rolling from right to left, and I'm going to plug the card now. And if there is, it's very little. Let's try this again. I don't see much. I can only see this couple of pulses, but I think it's just, I don't know, it's probably the fact that I'm plugging things around that doesn't look like a data input, and if it is, it's just literally one pulse. So I would say there is no communication between the CPU and the USB chip. We can try again on a different pin, which is pin 7, it's a different data line, plugging up now. Again, there's really nothing. If there is literally like one pulse, which doesn't mean much. So this is telling me it could be, well, it doesn't tell me much. I can see there is no communication. Does that mean the USB chip is not passing the information to the CPU, or the CPU is not doing anything and that's it, and nothing happens? I don't know. Now let's focus our attention on the Atmel chip, which I believe contains the firmware of the card, and it could explain the fact that nothing happens. Hopefully it's that simple. So I'm on pin 2, which is the output, the serial output of this IC. Let's plug the interface in a moment. Now, well, if I magnify here on the oscilloscope, you can see that we actually have data going in. As you can see, each pulse is different. So that's definitely, looks like valid digital data going back to the CPU, I guess. So to me, that is the CPU reading the firmware and potentially booting up. Now, at some point, if I keep scrolling, the signal will just, I don't know, will get kind of weird. And what we see here is like nothing. Doesn't look like valid data anymore. But the beginning of the trace, to me, it looks like it's a healthy communication between the memory IC and the CPU itself. Now, one important signal that we want to check on the CPU is the reset signal, and the datasheet of the CPU says that the reset signal is active low. So I'm supposed to see something that goes high at some point, and that means the CPU is actually active. So let's check that. I'm going to power up now. Oh, okay. Well, according to the manual, this is low, so it means the processor is in reset. Which doesn't make sense, as we could see some data coming from the flash memory. Let's try this again now. Yeah, it looks like it's driven low somehow, so oh, that's interesting. So I guess the next step would be to find out where the reset signal is coming from. Well, it's taken me a while to realize I had the oscilloscope in AC mode, and the AC mode will remove DC from the screen, and I'm measuring DC, so obviously a fixed voltage will be a 0-volt line. And now I'm in DC mode. Let's check the reset line again. There you go, it's high, it means it's not active anymore, so the CPU is not in reset. Now, because I see some data transferring between the Atmel and the CPU, I'm assuming the CPU has a clock and it is working fine. What I'd like to check is whether the USB IC has a valid clock, and that's on pin 21. And we do have a 26 megahertz, which according to the schematic is correct. So it looks like we have the clocks, the chips are not in reset, at least the CPU is not in reset, but there is no activity. And just out of curiosity, let's check pin 25 of the CPU, which is the clock for the CPU. This little bridge you see is from factory. It kind of doesn't make sense because pin 26 is ground, but I didn't do it, and that is definitely factory. I don't see any rework activity in here. So I'm assuming the board, the interface worked at some point. But let's check here, see what we see. And we have the same 26 megahertz, so obviously, as expected, the CPU has a working clock. Now, at this point, it's a bit difficult to try and ascertain what the problem is. I would say I'll go with my gut feeling, and I think I'll try and find a replacement for the USB chip. Now, it's clear from the datasheet that the USB IC is not getting any programming, is not getting anything. It's only an interface between the outside world and the CPU. The CPU seems to be doing something with the firmware. Now, the firmware could be corrupted as well. But because we had a fault with the USB cable, chances are something happened with our connectors. Probably, the pins ended up in the wrong place maybe, and maybe something got shorted. So the first thing I'd like to try is to replace the USB chip, which is going to be interesting because it's very small. I'm not really used to do it. I'm not Louis Rossmann, so I'll give it a go and I'll see if I can replace it successfully. Now, while I'm waiting for the USB chip, and it's going to take a few weeks to arrive from China, I was thinking of having a look at this Atmel IC, which should contain the firmware of the interface card. Now, I can check it with my programmer to see if there's anything that makes sense inside, and also I can see if I can find a dump from either this one or a slightly different card. Let me remove this IC, plug it into my programmer, and see what comes out of it. Okay, I've got the IC into my programmer. Let's read it and see what happens. Well, this is what we got, and something I've noticed is that it's mostly empty. So it's only arrives up to here, and the rest of the IC is completely empty, which could be very much intentional. I have no idea. So what I have found the firmware of the 2i4, which is pretty similar, as the CPU is the same, the firmware IC is the same, everything is the same, but the board has 2 extra outputs, which I don't care for at this moment. So what I can do, I can load that firmware on the software and then compare it to this one and see, if it's wildly different, like, it's like 10 times longer, or it's more or less there. Okay, that's the firmware of the 2i4, and I can see that this is also very much empty. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to verify what I have there in the buffer with what's on the IC itself. And there it is, the differences are highlighted in red, so you can see that there's a few bits different here. Most of the beginning of the firmware is the same, which is, I would say, a good sign, and then it becomes completely different, which, it doesn't mean really anything. But what matters is that, again, the beginning is identical and the length is more or less identical. That doesn't tell me much, but what I can try to do, I can try and load the 2i4 firmware onto the 2i2 and see if by any chance it's being recognized. If it is, then I will have to find the proper 2i2 firmware, which is not going to be easy, but I can do my best. If it's doing exactly the same, well, then I guess, or if it's not loading at all, it's completely dead, then I guess our problem is somewhere else. It's all good. Let's solder the IC back on the board and see if something happens. Okay, well, let's see if it made any difference. I'm about to plug the USB cable. 3, 2, 1, go. Nope. Same thing, same error message. I would say that, considering this is running on a completely different firmware, I would say that the next step is definitely the USB IC, and finger crossed with that one. While we wait for the USB IC, let me thank PCBWay for sponsoring this video. PCBWay is a leading PCB manufacturer and it's your stop for all your electronic projects. PCBWay.com is very easy to use, you just need a Gerber file, and once the order is placed, what you receive at home is a high quality PCB. I've used PCBWay for all my projects and I've always been impressed by the quality of the products. And don't forget that PCBWay also offer other services like 3D printing and metal sheet fabrication. Take a look at the website PCBWay.com, the link is also down below in the description. Let me thank PCBWay for helping this channel, their help makes these videos possible, so thank you very much for that. Now let's go back to the Focusrite. And the USB ICs have arrived. I've got 3 just in case something goes wrong with 1 or 2. As you can see, these are very, very small and I'm not very experienced when it comes to these ICs. So I've taken out my preheating board. It's probably overkill for such a small IC, but I just want to make things a bit easier. So I would say let's go ahead, remove the old and hopefully broken IC and let's install a new one. Removing the IC was not too bad, even though I'm using a soldering tip which is too big. At some point I realized I had left behind some solder on one of the pads, so I went back with some desoldering wick. Unfortunately, the whole pad came off. I'll let you hear my reaction when I realized.
No! Ma come? Ma è venuto via tutto! Ma dai!
Well, thankfully it was not connected to anything, so no big deal. Soldering the IC back was more challenging. Once again, I'm using a tip which is too big and it really doesn't fit in between the IC and that capacitor. Also, I can barely touch the pads of the IC itself. I eventually switched to a mediocre quality tip I have, which was much smaller though. I would still struggle to make good joints though. I think I should have magnified the pads a bit more and go over them one by one. My network failed while recording, so unfortunately this is where the video ended, but you just missed the cleaning part. Well, I'm ready to give it a go. Will it work? I'm not sure. Not too optimistic for some reasons. Let's plug this up. 3, 2, 1, go. Got lights. It's a good sign. I didn't hear anything from Windows. Just bad. Oh. Oh, something's happening. It looks like it's not being detected this time, so that's not good. But I can hear Windows detecting something and then it goes away, disappears straight away. So maybe it's just, maybe my soldering wasn't great. I don't know. I can see the USB light flashing, so it definitely gets detected for a moment, but then it stops, so it's not good. It's kind of better than before. I don't think the USB light was flashing, not sure about that. Well, it didn't work, but for a few seconds it actually stayed with the USB light turned on. The thing is, previously it was being detected as an unknown, well, it wasn't an unknown device, well, there was a device connected, but somehow refusing to communicate with Windows, and now it's not being detected at all. So, is the IC fake? Was my soldering not great? Did I break it by doing it? I don't know. What I can try and reflow it again, and I can try one of the other 3 chips and see if that changes anything. When inspecting the IC, I noticed one pad which seemed not soldered at all. So I tried soldering it again, which took a little time. At some point I thought about removing that capacitor temporarily so I could access the pads better, but I eventually decided not to do it in case something went wrong. During my final inspection, I noticed another pad which still didn't look great, so I spent a little extra time on that pad too. Take 2, I'm even less optimistic than before, but fingers crossed, maybe that was the issue. Let's try this up. 3, 2, 1, go. Yeah! Focus! It's working! Look at that, it's working! Wow! It's working! I can't believe it's working.
Oh my god!
I can't believe it's working! And I was about to remove it and just try another one or whatever. It was just my bad soldering. Well, I'm learning. So today I've learned a bit more on how to do these things. But yeah, I'm definitely not Louis Rossmann yet. That was coming from the sound card, so it does work, and I'm so happy because I actually need this card for something else, so it's great that I actually fixed it. Now, I would say let's give this card a little bit of service, a little bit of extra cleaning, some contact cleaners on all those jacks and inputs, and then we can put it together, and that should be it. And it works. I tested this card with all the inputs, all the outputs, everything works totally fine. And actually, as a final live demonstration that this is working, the sound of my voice you're hearing now is actually going through the Focusrite. I've connected my microphone to it and it's being recorded with Audacity on my laptop. So happy days, this is working perfectly fine. I'm pretty happy to have this working, also that it wasn't as easy as to just replace the USB port, because that would have been boring. So it's nice that we had an extra fault, but it's also nice that it wasn't anything further that USB receiver that was on the motherboard. So, it's kind of a good compromise in between complexity and reward at the end of the repair. As I said, I'm going to use this for something I'm doing for another project, and this is perfect. It's going to replace my Motu 4 Pre, which is my main desktop sound device, and this is almost as good as the 4 Pre. It's about 1 dB less dynamic, which is totally fine for me. That's exactly what I was looking for. It looks amazing. Now, a little gossip on this card. When I got it, it was covered in grime. It was disgusting, and it is so nice to see this board, this card, looking very shiny, very nice. It looks almost brand new, and the color is also amazing. It's fantastic. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, as usual, I'd appreciate a thumb up down below. Also, consider subscribing to this channel if you like this kind of things. Please do leave a comment. They are pretty important to me, and I try to respond to them all if I can. And that's it. I thank you for your time, wish you a great day, and I hope to see you again soon here on this channel for my next videos. For now, thank you very much, and goodbye. Bye-bye.